The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's this logical fallacy that is sort of informally called whataboutism in some circles. And Donald Trump, when interviewed on Fox News on Air Force One, coming back from the Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, was asked by Bret Baier about how he can say all these nice things about Kim Jong-un, despite the fact that he is a brutal dictator, that there are murders, forced starvation, all sorts of human rights and other abuses. And Donald Trump jumped headfirst into whataboutism, where he basically pointed out that, number one, listen, Kim Jong-un inherited a brutal regime from his father. So in some sense, I guess that excuses his being a brutal dictator and murdering people, and also pointed out that there are other countries that also do bad things, which again is not actually an argument because we have no obligation to deal with those countries if we don't want. We have no obligation to praise their leaders, as Trump did Kim Jong-un, as smart, talented, and a very good negotiator, and a very funny guy, and a guy with a great personality, right? You can recognize that there are bad people around the world or brutal people around the world, in addition to Kim Jong-un, without necessarily praising all of them. So I'm going to play this clip for you. It is Bret Baier interviewing Donald Trump on Air Force One. It is a horrible, horrible, incoherent explanation for why he all of a sudden thinks Kim Jong-un is so great.
You were asked in the press conference a number of different times and different ways about human rights, and that you called this relationship really good and that he was a very talented person. You call people sometimes killers. He is a killer. I mean, he's clearly executing people.
He's a tough guy. Hey, when you take over a country with tough people, and you take it over from your father, I don't care who you are, what you are, how much of an advantage you have. If you can do that at 27 years old, that's 1 in 10,000 that could do that. So he's a very smart guy. He's a great negotiator. But I think we understand each other.
But he's still done some really bad things.
Yeah, but so have a lot of other people done some really bad things. I mean, I could go through a lot of nations where a lot of bad things were done. Now,
but we're not praising the leaders of all of those nations. And we're not doing deals where we give everything away and get nothing verifiable or guaranteed in return. This interview, so there were a ton of interviews that were done with Trump after the summit. There was the George not a ton. There was the George Stephanopoulos interview, notably. There was the Bret Baier interview. There were a couple more major interviews that I'm forgetting now. And then there was also the press conference, right, during which questions were asked of Donald Trump. This 55-second clip with Bret Baier is actually the most disturbing in exposing what Donald Trump's mentality here is, which seems to be a sort of self-rationalizing based on bad things have happened in the world before, and thus we shouldn't be at all worried that I handed over to a brutal dictator a whole bunch of stuff that he wanted, and by the way, came up with proactive praise of him. This is really, really scary to me because of the precedent that it sets. It's scary to me because by virtue of being on Fox News, a ton of people will either never see it because they don't watch Fox, or people who do watch Fox won't find anything unusual about the commentary. But this is really, really dangerous stuff. And the other reason it's dangerous, and I'm curious whether you agree, Pat, is that Trump, we've observed these authoritarian tendencies on Trump's behalf. He seems to be in some way enamored with people like President Erdogan of Turkey. He thought it was just amazingly great when the Chinese president made it so that he could just continuously be reelected to president, and said sort of half jokingly, maybe we would sometimes try that here. Trump thinking that these brutal dictators are really great people and smart and great negotiators is very scary to us. And I think that we should all be very afraid of what is going on here.
Yeah, Rodrigo Duterte, Vladimir Putin, he'll praise dictators, but if you're a democratically elected leader, you won't necessarily get that praise. And I also love how he was able to compliment himself within that comment too, right?
Of course. Well, yes.
Like Kim Jong-un was 27 years old, took over for his father, and went on to lead a country. Kind of sounds like Trump, right? He took over for his father at the Trump Organization and turned that into such a beautiful business.
Turned it into a beautiful business, and it is the business of the presidency at this point for Donald Trump.
1 in 10,000.
Absolutely disgusting what we are seeing from Trump. And I wish that some on the right would say, I want to get along with other countries. I am still a Republican, but this can't be allowed. This can't be allowed because it signals a dangerous retreat into horrible ideologies. We have a fantastic program for you today. I'm really glad you're here with us on the Friday show. We will take some calls. We will review a great interview from the archives. We will answer some audience questions and much, much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Want to say a quick thank you to Sean Mahoney today. Sean is our new David Pakman Show member of the day. Membership, of course, our primary and #1 source of funding. You can sign up at www.joinpakman.com. You can save 40% by using the coupon code VOTESOON18. And Sean today is joined. It's a very special day because not only is Sean Mahoney our new member of the day, but Craig Guerin is our sustaining member of the day. Craig's been with us for 6 years almost at this point. Join both of them at joinpakman.com. If you want a simpler means to support the show with as little as $1 a month, you can go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Okay, let's see who's on the phone today. We've got our first caller from the 210 area code. 210, go right ahead. You can get into your question.
Hello, David.
Yes.
Yes, it's Joshua from San Antonio. I was just asking, are you excited for the World Cup, or are you going to boycott because it's in Russia?
No, I mean, listen, I hate that the World Cup is in Russia. I hate that the next World Cup is in Qatar. I think it's an absolutely immoral slave state, but I will be watching every game, absolutely. No, not every game, but listen, Argentina starts this weekend against Iceland, and I've been following, I mean, since I was a little kid, I've been following the Argentinian men's national team. So I will be watching, although the schedule is going to make it a little tough because there will be a lot of like 10 a.m. weekday games, but I will be watching, yeah. And I follow Dave Zirin, who says we can both be activists against the corruption of a sports institution, but still appreciate the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, I go for Mexico, and every time we go against Argentina, we always get our ass whooped by y'all. So
when was the last time, though? I don't remember the last time Argentina played Mexico in the World Cup.
I think it was in 2008.
Okay.
When Maxi Rodriguez made that badass goal. But anyways, yeah, man, love the show. Laters.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that call. And, you know, Mexico, when Argentina is out, Mexico is one of my favorite World Cup teams. Yeah, and I usually go Argentina, followed by, if Argentina's out, either Uruguay or, because they're kind of like our neighbors down in Argentina, or Mexico.
Fair to say Argentina will probably make it farther than those countries, right?
Argentina supposedly is ranked 4th, is what I heard, with something like a 3 or 4, or no, maybe it was like a 9% chance of winning it all.
Are we going to see the return of your Argentina jersey on the show?
We will indeed. We will indeed. Yes, no doubt about that. And I know that a lot of people will be very, very upset to see me wearing the Argentina jersey. Okay, let's go to our next caller from the 508 area code. A surefire way to get on the show is call from a Massachusetts area code. Caller from 508, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I got the 508 area code. I'm actually calling from 612.
Oh, all right. Well, I should hang
Minnesota.
up on you, but I'll still take a question.
Hey, I appreciate your show, man. I've been paying attention to everything that you're doing, and I like that you come with a mostly neutral view. The biggest question I had is you've been kind of a critic of both the left and the right, but more so the alt-right and their white identity politics that they play. And I wanted to know what your personal opinion was about identity politics overall, because it now seems that both sides are playing it pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's good? Do you think that it's bad? What do you see happening in the future with it? Because it does seem to be a relatively new concept, I guess, at least in popularity.
Okay, so let's go. A lot of good stuff in there. First of all, I don't think identity politics is necessarily new. It's really been around for decades. Bill Clinton used a version of identity politics. I do think that the way in which it's being employed right now or used has shifted a little bit. Here's my thought about identity politics. And this goes back to my story the other day where I said most things are kind of a gray area. You've got your critics of identity politics, and then you've got your sort of perpetuators of identity politics. I think that identity politics, where I come down is as follows, and then you tell me whether this makes any sense to you. It's important to recognize and listen to the experiences that people bring to discussions of political nature, sociocultural issues, etc., based on their experiences as members of an identity group, whether it's a religious identity group, a racial identity group, gender, whatever. We should listen to their voices. We should understand how it is that their membership in that identity group relates to the political issues that we're discussing. What I disagree with is the identity becoming a sort of trump card, and it's almost like a pun to say Trump card at this point because of the president, but it doesn't become a trump card, and it can't be a silencer of other ideas from people who maybe are not part of that same identity group. So that's where I come down, and I know people hear me say that and say that they'll just repeat, so are you for identity politics or are you against it? And it's like all I can do is repeat the same answer, which is we should be conscious and appreciative of those elements of identity, but they don't supersede all debate on any particular issue.
And that's about what I would expect. And I completely agree with you. I'm hoping that the mass majority of people come to that conclusion as well, because it does seem like there's been a lot of lines drawn in the sand, as you're saying, and a lot of silencing voices and other opinions rather than listening. And, I went on I've been a leftist for the majority of my adulthood, and I kind of recently started to listen to other ideas. And as a white male, at first glance, I was like, wow, they're speaking to me. And then obviously I go dig a little bit deeper and I realize that, okay, none of this is really based in fact. But it did bring the awareness to what you just said, and hopefully people will come across that. I think what you're doing will maybe open up some eyes and ears to that.
I hope so. All right, really appreciate the call. Sort of starting to get a connection issue, so I'm going to let you go, but really do appreciate hearing from you and hope to hear from you again. Let's go to our next caller from the 602 area code. Caller from 602, you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. David, how worried are you about future election tampering, be it by hacking by another country or person or by our own elected officials using even more voter suppression tactics like we saw in Arizona in 2016 with the placement of the voter booths was directly going to affect the impact or the way that the votes, the way that the election turned out is what I'm trying to say.
Very worried.
Future elections, which would be very important in a post-Trump world.
Yeah, I'm extraordinarily worried because you now have election tampering that can happen on multiple fronts, right? You've got the possibility of hacking voting machines, which has been covered for years at this point. You've got the possibility of foreign meddling, which, by the way, Robert Mueller says Russia is actively meddling in the midterm elections right now already. You also then have voter suppression tactics, right? Strategic limiting of voting hours, voter ID requirements for IDs that might themselves be free, but in order to obtain them, you need other documents which are not free to obtain, for example. So there is like a three-pronged attack on election integrity that's going on right now. Donald Trump doesn't seem even remotely concerned about it. That voter integrity commission was disbanded and was only even there to try to find evidence of 3 to 5 million illegal votes for Hillary Clinton. It was never really going to deal with the issues that we were facing. So I'm massively worried about it.
I would agree with you.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this is one of those issues where we try to talk about it year round, not just like the month before the election, but it's one of those issues that starts to get traction when it's mostly too late to do anything about it, sadly.
Right. The only time you could actually do something like implement ranked choice voting or change the system in any sort of legitimate way is probably not right before or right after an election when everybody's the most upset about it.
Yeah, although in a sense it's always either closely before or closely after an election, and that's part of the problem as well. I mean, it's a really bad situation. Really appreciate the call. Important issue. Okay, very good. I guess he hung up before I did. He was sick of me before I decided to move on. Let's go to our next caller from the 803 area code. 803, tell us who you are, and you can go right into your question.
Hi, my name is Joshua Jenkins. I'm here in Casey, South Carolina.
Joshua, before we go any further, we're not on speakerphone, are we?
No, I'm hearing you via my headphones.
Oh, okay, all right. Sounds like a speaker, but we'll deal with it. Go ahead.
Here's three things. One, I think the Republicans are trying to cover up their corruption by saying that some of the content in video games. And speaking of video games, I've heard from another news outlet about the use of modern music. And there was a song I heard in the video game I own once called Gangsta Rap Made Me Do It by Ice Cube. And I think the Republicans are trying to find an excuse to cover up their corruption for the Parkland shooting.
Okay, I don't know what you're talking about, Joshua. I'm doing the best. I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Sorry. It's just a lot of Republicans have came out and blamed some video game content about Parkland shooting.
Okay,
you
yeah.
Didn't hear about that.
Blaming violence in video games for real-world violence. Yeah. All right. I think Joshua has hung up. Oh, no, he just has absolutely...
No,
Joshua,
I'm
listen,
here.
I don't understand the question, and we can barely hear you, so I'm going to have to move on. But listen, we've talked about violence in media and the connection to real-world violence before, so definitely check out some of the work we've done on that. 682 area code. Caller from 682, go ahead.
Hey, Dave, this is Colby in Austin, Texas.
Hey, how's it going in Austin these days?
Pretty good. Things have been really good. I was just calling to ask, does Vegan Pat ever give you any of his vegan propaganda?
Not really. Pat has not really tried to indoctrinate me into veganism too much. He does. The one thing he has done is he likes to use the term excretions and secretions, I think, sometimes to ask me if I'm bothered by eating or drinking the secretions of animals, and I'm like, no, I'm not. I love it.
I like calling eggs, chicken eggs, for example, menstruations. That's
yeah,
the
menstruations. No, he hasn't really tried to do vegan propaganda on me.
Right. It was an interesting tactic. I was calling to ask because I asked once before about if you had seen any inconsistency in being against zoos and aquariums, but still choosing to eat meat and dairy.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that you use the Mediterranean diet. And, you get nutrition from that, whereas from a zoo and an aquarium you don't. So you don't really... So basically my question is, do you apply an ethic to your diet, or is the Mediterranean thing mostly a health thing?
No, listen, I've read a lot about animal rights, and it's not a big topic for me on the show, but there's actually a legitimate sort of framework for animal rights called the sliding scale framework, which much like I am in most areas of life, I think most things are a gray area. And, I find that a lot of vegan activism is very focused on sort of black-white type arguments, such as any sentient animal is exactly the same. And very quickly that will often fall apart when you get people to admit that actually they wouldn't necessarily recommend the same punishment for killing any animal. You wouldn't necessarily get the same punishment for killing a dog that you would for killing a bird. Most vegans, and correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, most vegans wouldn't advocate the same criminal punishment for killing a whale, dog, bird, and ant. And once you concede that, you are sort of de facto conceding that not all animals are the same. And that's basically my view, and I respect people who draw the line in different places. For me, Colby, cetaceans are over the line, monkeys are over the line, pigs and dogs are over the line. Cow is borderline for me, okay? I actually would like to get away altogether from eating red meat because for me, cow is pretty borderline. I do consider fish and bivalves and seafood and poultry to be on the other side of the line, so to speak. And I think reasonable people can sort of disagree about where that line is.
Right. Okay, I guess the last question would just be, you would say that factory farming in its current, form is basically unethical, and it's probably going to be something we'll look back on in history and say, that probably wasn't a good idea.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, yeah.
Yeah. All right, I was just getting a little more clarification on your ethical stance, and thanks for that.
All right, thank you, Colby. Appreciate it. Always glad to elaborate, I guess, on my position there. 617-830-4750. Let's go to our next caller from the 401 area code. 401 is Rhode Island, right?
That is correct.
Who's this?
So my name is Lauren Nidell. I was actually at the DNC meeting last Friday.
Okay.
And I just wanted to address a couple of your concerns. First of all, I was Bernie Sanders' state contact in Rhode Island, as well as a delegate to the 2016 convention.
Okay.
And I also happen to be on the state committee of Rhode Island. So I have kind of the in-out, inside-outside approach with how I've been dealing with politics in Rhode Island and nationally.
Okay.
So just what I'd like to address, first of all, the meeting wasn't that bad. The decision to change the verbiage of who should run or who can run under the Democratic title was pretty nominal versus what was already in place. The biggest difference was when a candidate will have to declare.
Mm-hmm.
Before, it was at point where they received a delegate. Now it's at point when they declare to run as a Democrat.
That's correct.
The big concern, and why I think this is a good thing personally, is that it will prevent people like Rocky De La Fuente not possibly from running. It could prevent Green members who decide, hey, I really can't get anywhere with the Green Party, I'm going to run as a Democrat. They may not be able to run as Democrats. And if you look at the whole Trump thing, it could also stop potential Republicans who decide, hey, I want to disassociate myself from the Republican Party, I'm going to run as a Democrat.
Okay, so that last one, though, Lauren, is not, like, that's never really been an issue, right? You admit that it's a hypothetical problem it would solve, but it's a solution to something that hasn't actually been a problem, right?
Absolutely hypothetical.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think that the problem was, and this is an argument that I've heard before, and it's not an argument that I think is untrue. The problem is that what you've seen the DNC do since the 2016, by and large, has not been the type of reform that most progressives who are not uniquely tied to the Democratic Party as their vessel for progressivism. Most progressives don't really think that the DNC has actually reformed in any way since 2016 that makes it a real progressive party or that they've solved the internal problems that they have. So when you hear that what they've done is make a modification to a rule that could conceivably impact Bernie Sanders, and I know why it's not actually going to impact him, it doesn't look great, right? Like, it doesn't inspire confidence.
So there's a couple of things with that. You know, being there, I could hear some of the, and one of the issues with the bylaws committee and is that the fact that they purged Bernie Sanders people off the bylaws committee. That was a significant issue for sure. One that was really the worst thing that they could do as far as solidifying the progressive movement within the Democratic Party and say you're welcomed to join us. So that was a huge issue. I'm not relinquishing that from the party for sure. I could actually hear people that were Clinton supporters, right? That were traditional Democrats, that were, moderate Democrats, definitely not Bernie-crats, hear them say and hear it in their inflection of their voice that something's got to change. Mm-hmm. We, even with the superdelegate vote, that we need to make sure that we do have an inclusive party and that we don't block people like Bernie. They even mentioned that this will not affect Bernie. That came out. And so I think it's important to keep that in perspective. The DNC changes, the superdelegate changes was definitely going towards the issue of not allowing superdelegates to vote that first round. So that was important. there were those, trust me, there were members that were like complete status quo, corporate Democrats. We don't want any change. We want everything to remain the same.
Yep.
Screw anybody else who wants anything different. But you could really hear that there was a strong portion of the members there that were saying that's just not gonna jive this time. So I think it's more positive than you may think. I am hoping for the best because we also know that there have been issues, down the road when they actually vote on things that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So I guess what you can say is that as a member of the Rhode Island Democratic State Committee and as a 100% Bernie Democratic Socialist, I have no issue saying that about myself. I am cautiously optimistic.
All right. Cautious optimism from Lauren calling from Rhode Island. Great to hear from you. Really appreciate it. That is all the time that we have today for calls. Sorry to everybody who's holding that I didn't get to you, but we will take calls again, and I appreciate everybody who did call. Quick break. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
People often ask me what have been my favorite interviews on the David Pakman Show. We've done over 1,000 interviews with something like 700 or 800 guests on the program. One that stands out is when I was able to interview one of my favorite science fiction writers, Joe Haldeman. And I interviewed Joe Haldeman in part about his book, The Forever War, which is a book that is sort of analogous with the Vietnam War. It is the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, or at least of 1968, which was arguably the war's worst year. And we are going to go back today to what is still one of my favorite interviews that I've done, sci-fi author Joe Haldeman from September of 2014. Let's check it out. We are joined today by Joe Haldeman, who is a Vietnam veteran and a science fiction writer whose best-known work may be The Forever War. His newest novel is Work Done for Hire. And as some of our viewers may recall, I've recommended both The Forever War and Forever Peace to you. Joe, it's such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for doing this.
Always glad to do it. Thanks.
So let's talk a little bit first about The Forever War, because this was the first book I read of yours. It's from the 1970s. How direct and overt were the kind of allusions to the Vietnam War that may come from your personal history in that book? Was that deliberate, or was it more of just the natural way that it went?
I would lean toward natural rather than deliberate. I mean, it was the war that I was in, so of course it provides a lot of the angles and details and so forth.
And when you think about the term forever war, in the book, of course, the reason that the war goes on for so long is related to the kind of logistics of time travel and time dilation. But was that the way it felt with the Vietnam War as someone who was in the nitty-gritty of what was going on?
I'd have to say that it wasn't really like that. I felt as if the war wasn't going on forever, but the people who weren't involved in the war didn't seem to worry much about it. And, you know, those of us who were fighting or recovering from it, it was the central fact of our existence. And yet America didn't seem to think it was that important at the time.
Is that the way it felt? In other words, we've heard this from others. We've even heard from people like John Kerry who have talked about what it felt like the perception was from those who were stateside. You felt as though it just wasn't really being paid attention to by mainstream America.
Well, in fact, the attention was mostly of a negative kind. You know, partly it's baby killer kind of exaggeration and the definite division in the United States between people who are in favor of the war and people who are both against the war and against any war, including yours truly. I mean, I was drafted against my will and went off to fight somebody else's war.
When you put together, when you start working on a book like The Forever War or Forever Peace, when I've spoken to nonfiction authors, they're very, very clear that they have the full story. They have essentially a fully formed outline or skeleton of what their book will be before they even start writing. Does it work that way with this genre that you write in, or is it a very different type of process?
For me, it's different. I do know writers of fiction who outline to it fairly well. You know, they might have 50 pages of outline before they start writing. For myself, I like to get the writing going and let the story generate itself as it grows. There are all kinds of ways to write a novel, and that's only one. That's the one that works for me.
Are the kind of tech elements and futuristic technologies and the like, are those often the catalyst for the story, or do you kind of conceive the story first and then you flesh out the sci-fi elements that are a part of it?
Well, I've gone both ways, actually. The one I'm doing now, Phobos Means Fear, actually came from an article in New Scientist, a little article, about 6 column inches. And I thought, holy cow, I've got to use that. And I sat down to write the book. But more often it's the other way around.
And where do you find that your ideas about these hypothetical technologies come from? In other words, are they rooted maybe in an actual science article you may have read, or do you feel that you kind of conceive them from the ground up?
Well, I guess you'd have to say they're rooted in my background. My education is in science rather than literature. And, you know, I see the world as a scientist does, I think, an objective kind of way. So my stories are colored by that viewpoint.
As I told my audience earlier on today's program, I recently finished reading Forever Peace, and that's a book that was written sometime before drone warfare, as we now are very aware of it if we're paying attention to the news, is being described to us. When you wrote that, I guess I'm not even sure how to ask this question. When you now hear about what's going on with drone warfare, and I don't want to give too much away about the book for people who haven't read it, did you have that in mind? Are you surprised by the way drone warfare has now become so prevalent?
I was a little surprised at how accurate my predictions were. I mean, I'm a science fiction writer. I don't write as a prophet. You know, if that future I described had not come to pass, it would still be a valid view of the future. I mean, it's a matter of dumb luck, actually. I seem to have predicted how the future was going to come about, but I really didn't expect that while I was writing it. I was just writing a story, and it needed drone warfare, which didn't have a name at the time, I don't think.
It's very interesting to me that one of the main issues that now is being discussed around drone warfare is this disconnection from the operator of the drone to the reality on the ground. And through imaginary technological means in Forever Peace, you, at least to some extent, maybe not to the plight of the victims, but at least to the idea of being there, you figured out a way to connect the drone operator, the machine operator, to what's going on the ground. When you think about modern drone warfare, is that a concern to you, this idea that there's this physical disconnection that may make these incursions almost video game-like?
Well, there's an element of that, of course. Now, when I was an engineer attached to the infantry in Vietnam, my main weapon was a radio telephone with which I could call in airstrikes and artillery support. Because I was in a very small unit, just sort of wandering around in the jungle, the woods in our case, and drawing fire from the enemy. And our main weapon was the radio telephone. So in that way, of course, it's a little bit futuristic. Although, to be honest, I first ran into it in records of World War II. So it was old when I was born, actually.
When you think about your early writing, when you go back and pick up, and maybe, I don't know if you even do this, but if you were to kind of page through the Forever War, are you still satisfied with it? What are your reactions to your earlier work? And you know, when I go back and look at a program I did only 5 years ago, I'm incredibly self-critical of what was going on. Either I didn't make the point the way I wanted to, or I missed key details, or whatever the case may be. What's it like to go back and look at something you wrote 30 years ago?
You know, for one thing, you have to. I'm charitable with other writers. When I read somebody else's work, I say, okay, he's doing the best he can.
Right.
That's the way I look at my old work. I would write it much differently now. Of course I would. I hope I've continued learning about writing. But in fact, that guy was writing 40 years ago. What could he know about what is the rather distant future now? As I say, I have sympathy for the person I was 40 years ago, but we don't feel the same way about many things.
That's fair. Maybe when I look back at my old shows, I should just say, that's the best I could do at the time with the experience and the skills that I had.
That's exactly it. In fact, trying to evaluate your own creativity is kind of a fool's game anyhow, because basically your success is not based on your evaluation of it. It's based on the other people, the people who pay to read or watch your stuff. So, you do the best you can, then you move on and do something else the next day.
For our television and radio audience, we will pause there and go to a break. We will stay with Joe Haldeman, and we will have the complete interview on our YouTube channel. To talk for a second about not so much being charitable or not, or criticizing your past work, but in looking at your writing style, one of my favorite authors is John le Carré, and one of his earlier works is The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and that's almost a 50-year-old book at this point. Wow. And he's written a book every couple of years for more or less the last 40 or 50 years. And while the themes of his writing have changed significantly, going from the Cold War to kind of more modern, maybe radical Islam, etc., I can't really identify significant ways in which his style has changed over a pretty long period of time. Do you think your style of writing has changed over the last 40 years?
I know it has. I have been a writing teacher as well as a writer, and I can be a little bit objective about my own production. And I can tell I made mistakes 40 years ago that I would not make now. Now, I'm making mistakes now that I don't see. I know that's true. It's true of every writer, but they're not the same ones. I have watched the sort of reaction to my work, and I've taken some, I don't like being criticized. Nobody does. But I listen to it, and I try to improve my current writing from the comments other people made from my earlier work.
Are there particular science fiction writers that you either read or followed or not necessarily modeled your work after, but who was it that you really liked reading?
When I was a kid, I really loved Robert Heinlein. And, let me see, James Blish and Alfred Bester was a big one. Arthur Clarke, of course, Harry Harrison, Isaac Asimov, all the old guys. When I was a kid, I ate them up. And I suppose the reason I don't eat them up now is I guess I've become too overexposed and too sophisticated. I do read some science fiction every now and then, but I don't try to keep up with it. I mean, 1,000 books a year, Jesus, you wouldn't be able to do anything else if you kept up with it.
That's interesting. I talk to a lot of people who seem to not, whether it's television, radio, or books, they don't follow their particular genre or area very closely. And I find this even applying to me. In other words, the reading I do to prepare for my program, which is mostly news and politics, of course relates to that. But my personal reading, so to speak, has very little to do. I wonder if there's something about thinking about or putting energy into areas that are unrelated from your work that in some way kind of helps you within your own field.
Well, I do think it helps me. I have seen in other people's writing a kind of a mutual appreciation society. I see people who are influenced by the same people who influenced me, so I can't claim to be somehow immune to this. But I think that you should watch it. You should watch for repetition in your work. You should watch for influences that maybe were better left with the previous artist. I don't know. The thing is, trying to talking about your own writing is foolish and dangerous, of course. Talking about other people's writing can be even worse because people might suspect your motives. Say, oh, he's getting paid too much. Don't read him. Yeah.
I have one question that I came up with when reading Forever Peace, which is in the book, You mention a character reading The Long Goodbye by Raymond Chandler, and that Raymond Chandler is one of my favorite authors, and The Long Goodbye, among his work, one of my favorite books. Was that of particular significance to you, or was there any hidden meaning to one of your characters reading that book?
You know, the hidden meaning is not hidden at all to me, because I happened to read that novel while I was writing the book. And so I just put it in there. He's a great model, of course, for anybody who writes masculine fiction, not just genre fiction. So yeah, my printer is making strange noises. Are you picking them up?
No, and I assure you, I'm not controlling it in any way. So it's not me by any means.
I think it's coming from my wife's computer about 200 yards away.
So, Joe, last thing I want to touch on is, you mentioned what you're working on now. Your latest work is Work Done for Hire. Can you tell us anything about what you're working on today?
Well, what I'm working on today is a novel called Phobos Means Fear. And it's a hard SF novel, hard science fiction. That is to say, the level of science in it is pretty high. The main character is a scientist, and she's going through a sort of late midlife crisis. She's in her 60s and does feel somewhat estranged from younger scientists. So in a way, it's kind of autobiographical. I think most novelists can't get away from that trap.
Are there ever days where you just don't feel like writing at all?
Very rarely. You know, in fact, it's quite the contrary. I don't enjoy writing every day, but I certainly don't like days when I don't write. When I'm on vacation and supposed to be having fun, I'm going, yeah, where's my word processor? I'm supposed to be doing something here.
No question. We've been speaking with Vietnam veteran Joe Haldeman, science fiction writer, The Forever War, Forever Peace. The newest novel is Work Done for Hire. Joe, really a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's jump into audience questions for the week. First one, hey David, the generic ballot has been narrowing for a few months now. Why do you think that is? Should Democrats be worried? So to make sure we're all on the same page, when we talk about the generic ballot, this is a ballot that looks not at specific congressional or Senate races for the midterms, but it looks generically at Democrats versus Republicans. And that was an area where Democrats had a bigger advantage for some time. That advantage has been narrowing for a few months as we close in on the November midterms. The answer, should Democrats be worried, is absolutely yes. And why I think it's happening, there's a couple different reasons, and in no particular order of importance. Number one, hyper-normalization. A lot of the insanity that is going on right now that we thought would keep interest and enthusiasm very, very high straight into the November midterms has made it so that scandal becomes a constant, and when everything's a scandal, nothing is a scandal, and we are seeing things happen on a week-to-week basis, daily basis almost, that if they were in a normal administration, they would have people protesting in the streets every single day, but they become part of the sort of background of scandal, and over time, humans have an incredible ability to sort of be acclimated to anything, and it becomes less of a catalyst to get out there and vote. That's number one. Number two, Democrats have not really been doing a great job at explaining what it is that they want to do if they actually take control of the House and or Senate in 2018. We hear a lot of discussion about impeachment. I think that it is absolutely reasonable to be thinking of impeachment on the basis of the results of Robert Mueller's investigation once we have it, but that's not policy, right? Impeaching Trump, although, yes, it would conceivably stop the bad things he's doing for people economically, it is not the type of positive, and by positive, I don't mean like positive in the value judgment sense, but positive, it's defensive in a sense. It's, well, we would get rid of Trump by trying to impeach him. That's not actually a platform. And I have been warning about this for a long time. From the very beginning of the Russia investigation, I've been saying Democrats need to make sure that the investigation can continue and that Robert Mueller does what he's supposed to do and what he's trying to do. But it's really important to actually have a platform, because if nothing happens with Mueller, if everything is about the Russia investigation, you're left with nothing. If for some reason the Mueller investigation led to Trump being removed from office before the midterms, you still then need something to run on that can't be, we're going to get rid of Trump, because Trump would already be gone, although very clearly that's not going to happen. So I think that this is partially self-inflicted by the Democratic Party. I think partially this is the hyper-normalization. And one other thing, the DNC also is not doing itself any favors. We talked earlier in the week about the story where the DNC said that you have to be a Democrat and legislate as a Democrat to run as a Democrat, which seemed like a law directly targeting Bernie Sanders, who caucuses with Democrats and is an independent, but is running in the Democratic primary, even though if he wins, he wouldn't actually accept the Democratic nomination. He would switch back to independent. The DNC is claiming it's not actually targeted at Bernie. It does seem like it is. These are the sort of self-inflicted wounds that we are seeing from the Democratic Party. As many of you know, as most of you probably know, I'm not a Democrat. I never have been. I am a progressive individual. When the best path to progressivism in any particular race is through the Democratic Party, I vote for a Democrat. But I have no allegiance to the Democratic Party in and of itself. And I think the Democratic Party is screwing up big time. And yes, Democrats and progressives at large should be very worried about November of 2018. David, there's a movement happening in France and elsewhere to make the language more gender neutral. How do you feel about people trying to fundamentally change language like that? So there's a couple different things I want to say here. As a native speaker of Spanish, Spanish like French, and Romance languages in general, words have gender and like nouns have gender. So even like the pen and, you know, the mug have gender. Those words have gender in a way that just saying water in English is not a word that has gender. I think this movement is important to distinguish sort of into two sub-movements, right? There's a difference between degendering words that reference people and degendering words that reference inanimate objects. So in Spanish, for example, when you say Latina with an A on the end, you're referring to Latina women, right? It directly implies. And if you say Latino, that's the masculine version, which is the default if you have like a mixed group. So if you have a group of Latino individuals, that could be all men or it could be men and some women. And there's been a movement to degenderize that by replacing the O or A at the end with an X. I don't actually know exactly how it's pronounced. I'm not part of this movement, but I'm very much aware of it. And in different countries, it's sort of taking hold to differing degrees. That's one thing. Another thing is to try to degender all words. Like, for example, in Spanish, when you say, you know, el avión, the airplane, that is, by virtue of using el as opposed to la, it is a masculine word. And the degendering of that makes absolutely no sense to me. I don't think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And this actually gets into pretty deep philosophical ideas about the impact of language in creating our perception of the world. There's postmodernism in this. There's existentialism in this. And there's this idea that we see the world partially, whatever degree of patriarchy you identify in the world, in great part comes from the language that we use to describe the world. And if we put gender into words, whether it's the pen or the mug or the paper or whatever, that is in a sort of structural way reinforcing gender roles and subjugation of women, etc. That argument is one that I actually am not even that interested in having. And if you force my hand, I could come up with arguments one way or the other. I'm much more pragmatic, and my pragmatism tells me that there is a limited amount of political capital and resources that are out there, and that there are other ways that are much lower hanging fruit than removing gender from Romance languages that would be more immediately good for women. Making it so that 20 white Republican dudes don't decide about closing down abortion clinics, for me, is a much more immediate way of remedying acute problems that exist in our society. If you want to argue that there's a meta issue, which is that mug and pen are gendered, that nouns are gendered in Romance languages, well, convince me of that. But I'm not seeing how that is the most worthwhile use of resources right now. When it comes to words that reference people, I actually do sympathize with that a little bit more, right? The idea that if there's a mixed group or that there's unknown gender, you always default to the male pronoun or referring word. Okay, I can understand that, and I'm sort of open to how replacing Latino and Latina with Latinx might change that, or it might not. But the idea of degendering all words to achieve some kind of egalitarian paradise, I don't get it, and I know that people are going to be very mad. Max is nodding. He knows people are going to be very, very mad at me. But hey, you know what? Like Steven Crowder says, I'm open to having my mind changed, so just email in. Okay, last question today. Hey, David, how do you feel about the YIMBY movement going on in cities like Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and elsewhere? So YIMBY comes from NIMBY. NIMBY means not in my backyard. There was a lot of discussion about NIMBY here in Massachusetts surrounding the Cape Wind project, which would have put a bunch of wind farms far enough offshore of Cape Cod that they would have been about an inch or half an inch in your sort of vertical horizon from shore. And there was a big movement that claimed to be politically progressive and wanting alternative energy, but was saying, yeah, but not in my backyard, not off the coast of Cape Cod where I would see it. NIMBY now has a corollary called, or a counterpart called YIMBY, which is yes in my backyard. And that movement is one that seeks to solve a number of different housing and economic issues that are going on, including hugely overinflated, or if not overinflated, escalated, increased housing prices, partially as a result of undersupply of affordable housing. And the YIMBY movement is a movement that is based on sort of an understanding of how if you make housing more affordable in general, even if it's, yes, in your backyard with affordable housing or the type of housing that rich people might not always want right next to them, that it's actually going to solve a lot of problems and reduce negative externalities and better crime data, et cetera, et cetera. So I am basically a YIMBY type person ever since living in New York and even now in Boston. I live in places I want to live in, all of which are in close proximity to mixed income buildings, public housing for individuals who are, I believe it, I know Section 8, I never remember if Section 8 is a local term or a federal term, but low income housing. And it's never occurred to me to look to live elsewhere as a result of that. I've never encountered any issues as a result of that. I welcome when there is a new building in Condoville, Boston, which is where I live, coming in where half of the units are going to be reserved for people with family incomes, household incomes under $70,000, for example, meaning it could be two people making $30,000 each. I think that all those things are good. And I think that the more I read, and since last week's live calls, I've actually been reading a lot more because we got a question about this, about what can be done to deal with the hugely exploded housing prices. Supply is actually a big part of it. There are other regulatory things that can be done, and there's many other ideas, but you've got to increase the supply of housing. That actually is a big part of it, and it's got to be relatively affordable housing. So I am in favor of the YIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard, although I don't literally have a backyard because there's other apartments there. But if I had a backyard, I would say go ahead and build there. Why not? Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Get access to the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpacman.com or becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.